So, recently I was watching a debate between left-wing YouTuber Vaush and an anarcho-capitalist libertarian presidential candidate called Adam Kokesh, where Adam Kokesh basically brought up the argument in an attempt to justify, private property and also unequal distribution of private property. In its ownership, he used John Locke's work, and it really sort of personified the common arguments that I see used by libertarians and conservatives coming from John Locke. However, having read John Locke quite extensively and written a lot of articles about him, and specifically his views on private property, there's a lot of things that are either overlooked or simply just gotten wrong by libertarians and conservatives when they try and deploy John Locke's work in their arguments. So in this video, what I'm going to do is go over the basics of John Locke's argument, from the beginning to its end, and then sort of go through the points where people often get it wrong and conservatives will often misuse, misinterpret, or just simply ignore key elements of John Locke's work. So basically, John Locke argues argues prominently for the importance of private property rights. So this begins with what's called the survivor argument. It's very simple. No one wants to die. No one should die. You have a right. It is morally right for you to do what you need to do in order to survive. And John Locke would say that private property is needed for this survival to be able to happen, to be able to, for example, work land and farm and things like that. So the beginning is people don't want to die. People shouldn't have to die. Therefore, private property is fine. The first problem we arise here is that this doesn't justify any property beyond what is needed to survive. It especially doesn't justify any sort of unequal distribution of private property, because as long as you have enough to survive, then that is the property that is necessary, and everything else can be left in the common, as Locke would describe it, basically, owned by everyone or owned by no one. So this is when, in order to try and justify these further property rights and this particularly unequal distribution of property, comes in the most famous argument that's often deployed, and this is what's called the labor mixing argument. It's a relatively simple one. It's basically derived from the liberal conception of self-ownership. You own yourself and you own your labor, your work. So therefore, when you mix your labor with something by working with it, it becomes yours. So in this sense, the best example is there's apples on a tree. When I pick apples off a tree, I have mixed the apples with my labor, with something that I own, so therefore the apples leave the common and they become mine. So yeah, it seems relatively simple in the beginning. It seems like something relatively reasonable. By putting work into something, it becomes yours. You have mixed something that you own with something that you don't, and then it is yours. This is what Adam Kokesh used in the debate as a means of labor justifying ownership and property. There is quite a famous rejection, or I guess counter argument to the labor mixing argument in this sense, specifically in the form of mixing something you own with something you don't, and that's by Robert Nozick in the book Anarchy, State and Utopia, which I have actually right next to me. Where basically he says, well, okay, sure, what if I walk up to the sea, I have my can of tomato juice and I pour it into the sea? The tomato juice molecules mix in with the ocean, and therefore I've mixed something that I own, this can of tomato juice, with something that I don't, so it becomes mine. Which is obviously ridiculous as a means of claiming the ocean. However, it does expose some arbitrary nature in John Locke's labor mixing argument. It does show that there are issues with how this is a means of claiming property, because why does mixing something that I own with something that I don't just make it mine? Why does mixing a can of tomato juice with the ocean not make the ocean mine, when picking some apples, mixing something that I own with something that I don't own, make that mine? And then the common response, which is very reasonable, and I actually think comes, I guess, indirectly from John Locke's work. It's not really something he makes very specifically clear. However, he does point out that specifically the big part of the labor mixing argument is that it provides value to whatever you're doing. So if you have a patch of land, by working that land and farming that land, you improve that land by growing crops. By picking an apple tree, you improve what you've done, because now you have apples that are are able to be consumed. So you can make the argument, well, labor mixing is only reasonable when it is you applying value to something. It is when you actually add value onto something, which is a reasonable response. But then it starts to call into question, if you take that premise, some issues of conservative or libertarian values in the sort of more anarcho-capitalist section, where it is rent seeking. The idea that someone is making loads of money or doing things which don't actually produce any value in this sense, but is perfectly fine and legal would be illegal in these societies. And under that idea, that wouldn't be a justification of property because you haven't improved anything. I haven't improved the ocean by pouring my tomato juice in, so I don't own it. And whilst that does have some minor complications, there are things like, well, what if I spray paint a rock pink? It's now a pink rock. Someone could like that. Does it become mine? And it can get a bit messy. However, I think on its basis it is relatively reasonable to say, right, when you create value in something, it can become yours. Sure, fine. And there's also the idea of, well, is the surplus only yours, or is the original thing yours? So with land, for example, if I'm growing crops on a field, and when I improve it, why does the land become mine? Why not just the crops that I've grown? And that sort of falls into a sort of a further issue with, I guess, ownership of means of production, I guess, if you count land as a means of production. I'm not exactly sure, but that becomes an issue, because why do I have claim ownership of land if it is the value which matters? Surely I only own the increased value, so I would only own the crops, or if I would only own the apples that I've plucked rather than the tree itself, which is a complication. But then moving on from this initial issue with his argument, becomes the big two, I guess what you would call background conditions in Locke's work, which are very often overlooked and ignored and frankly forgotten, whether it be because they haven't read far enough, or whether it be because it doesn't really suit their aims. The first of these background conditions, which Locke applies as a means to allow this justification of private property, particularly uneven distribution of private property, is basically that the claiming of resources can't negatively impact someone else's ability to claim other resources. So basically, in order to claim something as your own private property, there needs to be the case where there is enough and as good left in the common for others. So Locke was writing obviously at the time of Manifest Destiny in America, when it was getting settled, and he saw America as an abundance of land. There was an abundance of resources. It was virtually limitless, which meant that claiming a plot of land wouldn't negatively impact someone else because there's plenty of land in the future to be claimed. This is obviously a difficult premise to justify, because sure, maybe when you're like settling America, you can see how that could potentially be okay, but in the modern day, things are owned. There simply isn't this unlimited resource. The planet's a lot bigger now as well. There's a lot more people. There simply isn't this unlimited resource. So how can claiming of property not negatively impact someone else? And this is when you can reintroduce the survival argument, where you say, well, look at the world right now. There's plenty of people who are starving. Is it not morally reprehensible that people are claiming property when these people are starving? They can't access these resources in order to survive. So even the most basic argument of Locke's work, one of the most foundational principles of his work, really falls into question when trying to apply it to a modern day. And then Locke's response would simply be, well, this is when we bring back everyone's favorite liberal self-ownership, back to labor. You can, this is where individuals will trade their labor with someone who owns land in an exchange for basically, for these resources. So if I'm a landowner, I would say, right, I get it. I've taken this land technically from everyone here. I apologize maybe. And in exchange, as a means so that I'm not, I haven't just taken it, I will give you people jobs on the farm so that you can have a wage and live. And that is when basically in a consensual interaction, people or individuals will trade their privately owned labor to someone else in order to be able to work this land that they own. However, it immediately falls into issues with the previous labor mixing argument. So if I'm working for someone on a farm, why don't I own what I'm doing? My surplus labor, the fruits of my labor, to put it in a literal sense, are being extracted from someone who owns this land. So why isn't this reasonable? I'm still mixing my labor with something. And surely if this person owns it and I'm working on it, they don't really have a legitimate claim because I'm the one improving the land. I'm the one providing this value. And whilst it would be argued that, well, this is a consensual voluntary relationship, that can be definitely questioned, because even if it is, then surely you still have this right to claim. The fruits of your labor are technically still yours. They should be yours. Instead, they're being extracted for little, really, because there is still this issue of these property rights being somewhat arbitrary. Following on from this, which I would say is probably the most important premise or condition that people ignore when trying to talk about John Locke, is what's called the no spoilage proviso. So this basically says that if someone has loads of stuff. Let's say, you know, I'm someone, I've picked all the apples. I have loads of apples. People come to me and they say, hey, you've got loads of apples. Can we have some? And I say no. And then so these apples are gonna, you know, they're gonna rot. They're gonna spoil. The people would be morally justified in taking these excess apples from me, because I would be wasting them. You know, in Locke's, you know, paraphrased own words, it's something along the lines of, basically, it's a sin to waste the things that God gave us. So if someone is wasting what God gave people, then it's justified to take it from them and then to improve it. You know, you are wasting God's gift. You're not providing this value, so therefore you have no ownership over it in this sense. This was part of the argument used to justify the taking of land and resources from Native Americans, because the point was, well, they're simply wasting it. You know, the argument was they're not improving the land, they're not, you know, harvesting resources enough, therefore it is reasonable for the people, or I guess the new people, to take these resources in order to not waste the things that God gave them. This is basically where the idea of money comes in. So one big problem with John Locke's work, I think, is that he says that anyone to hoard or anyone to hoard anything, or, you know, hold on to goods that they couldn't use themselves, would be illogical and stupid, and no one would ever do it. However, that's obviously not true. We see that today. It's obviously a means of power to hoard a lot of things. So Locke would say, right, simple. This is where we bring money in. Money is a system of maintaining value, which can be exchanged for goods and services.
Money can be exchanged for goods and services. Woohoo!
And as a means of holding value, so that I can trade these apples while still holding on to the value of the apples. Therefore, they won't be spoiled because I have an incentive to trade them away, basically. And that will mean that nothing gets wasted. Yay! So therefore, we have the libertarian capitalist, you know, utopia of nothing gets wasted because people can trade it. However, so this was what was brought up in the Vaush and Adam Kokesh debate, where basically Vaush gave an example of, you've crashed your plane, you landed, you were passed out for 30 minutes. Your friend is awake though. He's the only other survivor. He's gotten up. He's plucked all the coconuts from every single tree, and then he puts them in the middle of a beach. And he says, right. And you wake up and you go, oh my god, what's happening? You go, right. I've picked every coconut here. You need these coconuts to survive, but you're gonna have to basically be my slave. And then you can have some coconuts. You can have 1 or 2 coconuts. And Adam Kokesh, you know, kind of trying to use Locke's work, didn't know about spoilage proviso, because you would say, well, that's reasonable to take them from them. But then this is where it kind of falls into issue with the libertarian justification by using John Locke's work, is that it's very simple. You know, the no spoilage proviso provides a strong, not just a justification, almost a moral duty to have a redistributive system, because people at the top are going to be hoarding things, they're going to be wasting things, they're going to be spoiling things, and, you know, I guess in an anarcho-capitalist society, if Locke was the one running it, he would say, right, the people can collectively come together and then take these things, but obviously that's unrealistic. What are we going to have, like a revolution every year or so to try and take these resources? Plus, people with lots of resources are obviously very powerful, so it's not necessarily that realistic. So the only real, I guess, way we could implement this idea would be through a, you know, redistributive wealth and resource system that we kind of have now, but we would need to be even stronger, I guess. And I guess, you know, and the classic, the simple response would be, well, you know, let's say I'm Jeff Bezos, I have loads of money in the bank. I'm not wasting that money. It's not going to go off. That's the point of money being introduced. It's that items can't be spoiled. However, there's the problem with the two words of one word spoilage and one word wastage. So Locke often conflates the two terms. So, for example, when I brought up earlier with Native Americans, he said that they were wasting the land. This land isn't spoiling. The land wasn't spoiling. It's just sitting there. You know, it's still waiting to be used. There was no justification under a spoilage proviso to take said land, because they were wasting it. They weren't letting it spoil. Rather than if I had 1,000 apples, I can't eat 1,000 apples. They're going to spoil. So in this sense, you could apply the same argument to Jeff Bezos. He has $1 trillion somewhere. I don't know where, probably in the Cayman Islands. And whilst it's not spoiling because of the ability for money to maintain value, it is in this sense wasted because it's not doing anything. And then once again, you can add up, you can back up this wasted argument by saying, well, look, it's being wasted as well as people are starving in the world. Back to the survivor argument. This was your core tenet of your argument that has to be applied here, because not only is this being wasted, it's not being used, and it's just sitting there. It's not being used to maximize the gifts of God. It's simply just sitting there doing nothing whilst people are starving and dying of a lack of resources. So this is where this premise in particular strongly justifies a redistributive state, and this I think is the main thing that conservatives will often get wrong when they deploy John Locke in their arguments, in their work, and anything that they do. They will always ignore the no spoilage proviso. And John Locke implements it because he understands the importance of people, not hoarding things, basically, even though he thinks it wouldn't be very realistic. He says that, well, it would be an insult to God to waste the things that he's given us. So therefore, the no spoilage proviso is very important. So really, if you're trying to implement John Locke's property rights, you need to, implement this system of a strong redistributive system. So in particular, Adam Kokesh, being a full-on libertarian anarcho-capitalist, really, I think, misused John Locke's work. I think any actual legitimate reading of John Locke will lead you down this path, specifically through these two premises. So overall, I would say that what is ignored is, one, the prevalence of the survival argument in John Locke's work. That is a fundamental concept in what he does and can be applied in several different areas to sort of critique what he does and what he argues. Obviously the flaws of the labor mixing argument, there's plenty of debates around it being an arbitrary nature. However, if we're just going to assume he was correct, the real issue that I think libertarians in particular will get wrong about John Locke's work is that they will ignore the two key background conditions in order for the system to function in any reasonable manner. The first one being, the need for, I guess, unlimited resources, which is obviously very unrealistic, but then labor can sort of try and solve that. But then you get into issues of, is it a voluntary relationship if someone owns everything and I need to do it to survive? And the main one being the no spoilage proviso, which is pivotal to John Locke's justification of private property, and particularly unequal distribution of private property, meaning that things can't be wasted, and it would by all means, I think, reasonably justify a prominent redistributive system. And how that would work doesn't necessarily have to be a state, I guess. If you were going to take this literally. However, it certainly does not fall into any sort of libertarian or anarcho-capitalist framework to say that there needs to be this sort of redistribution, because otherwise, things basically fall into a feudal style society where someone owns everything and then they're never giving any of it away and they're never trading it because that gives them power. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is the first one of these I've kind of made, so if you like it, give a like and a subscribe, all of those sort of things. I've got plenty of other philosophy stuff I can go into, so if you do like, just check in the comments if anything else you want me to go into about political philosophy. And if I was wrong about anything, which is very likely, just chat it in the comments. I'd love to hear what people think about John Locke and his justification of private property. Right. I've been Hugh, this is Dutiful Future, and this has been what conservative libertarians often get wrong about John Locke and private property. Thanks for watching.